both actually, President Trump and President Putin. They're both losing this game. I think, well, particularly given the tariffs that have come up, because now oil prices have plummeted, and I think oil and gas make up about 30% of Russia's economy. And this is a serious, they're the lowest they have been in 4 years. Putin is, look, he has to maintain, um, he has to really maintain this conflict at a pretty high level if he's going to make any progress. And this is expensive. And he's losing huge numbers of soldiers. So to have the economy go on the skids is very dangerous for Putin personally.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Joining us today is Amy Knight, a historian and expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union. Amy is the author of several books on Russia and the Kremlin, including The Kremlin's Noose, Putin's Bitter Feud with the Oligarch Who Made Him Ruler of Russia. Amy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So just to start, Amy, Ukraine has released this footage of an apparently Chinese man that they say was captured from a Russian army unit, along with some others. How serious of an allegation is that?
Well, it's quite possible. I mean, I don't think Ukraine is lying when they say that there were Chinese soldiers fighting on Russia's team, but I think they're making kind of a mountain out of a molehill. From what I've read, it's possible that these are just mercenary kind of soldiers, and there are not very many of them. And of course, the Chinese government has denied that they are sending soldiers. I know that China has been supporting Russia by giving them munitions and so on and so forth, but I think that my suspicion is that perhaps Ukraine is heightening this and blowing this up a little bit because they're sort of playing on Trump's anti-Chinese stance right now with these huge tariffs. And so now there's this big trade war going on between China and the U.S., and this is kind of an opportunity for Zelensky and the Ukrainians to tie the Chinese as a foe, to tie that into their own cause in the war, if you see what I mean.
And like you say, it's not really suggested that the Chinese have sent these people to Ukraine. But could the Kremlin be in trouble with Beijing if they've kind of recruited these Chinese citizens the same way they've recruited other foreign citizens who kind of came to Russia on the pretenses of doing work there and then were kind of pushed into a contract?
That's a good question. I mean, if this sort of happened inadvertently, I would doubt it. And given that we're only talking about a few Chinese soldiers, I don't expect it to be a cause of a real tension between Beijing and Moscow right now. As I say, I think this is more something that's been emphasized on the Ukrainian side. And I might add that it actually is working their strategy. I was reading this morning, the State Department spokesman said, quote, China, in response to this issue with the soldiers, China is a major enabler of Ukraine. It provides nearly 80% of dual-use items Russia needs to sustain the war. So the Trump administration is kind of buying into this.
Well, other comments out of the US administration today, the United States ambassador to the UN, Dorothy Shea, told the Security Council the US has no patience for bad faith negotiations and they'll judge Putin by his actions. On the other side of that, though, there seem to be few actions so far that suggest Russia is really serious about a long-term peace, do they?
Very few. I mean, they've been bombing Ukraine like crazy and killing innocent civilians. I mean, if anything, they've really stepped up their war effort, and they're now apparently starting on their spring offensive. They've brought in thousands more soldiers, so there doesn't seem to be any real intention on Moscow's part to to go forward with the ceasefire. And it's interesting because they sent their emissary Kirill Dmitriev here to Washington just a few days ago, and he was saying he's the head of the Russian direct investment fund, and he's quite close to his wife is close to Putin's daughter, and he's been used previously in negotiations, and because Dmitriev um, has studied in the United States and knows Jared Kushner, et cetera, et cetera. He's seen as a very useful envoy. So it's interesting because he was just here and having these talks in Washington, and he said there's going to be so much more cooperation between Russia and the US. And he hinted that the sanctions would be eased, and that, things were proceeding along the lines of a ceasefire. And then in the meantime, we have this completely contradictory situation. So, yeah, it's a rather difficult thing to kind of analyze right now.
And we're expecting more talks tomorrow, I believe, on normalizing those relations between the US and Russia. But kind of strangely, they've explicitly said this is just about normalizing relations. It's not about the ceasefire. Um, are the Russians kind of getting what they want in this situation by just talking about uh, these negotiations of normalizing the relations without having to do anything, give anything back in terms of ending the war in Ukraine?
Well, they've been even more specific, U.S. spokesman, not normalizing relations, but basically normalizing the diplomatic kind of operations at the embassies. So my take on it is they're really going to be the talks are going to be in Istanbul. They're going to be discussing, like, you can have four people come and we're going to do this and that. So it's not a broader normalization at all. Yeah, and it stands in sharp contrast to, I mean, just last month, Putin and Trump had a 3-hour conversation, and we had these negotiations in Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And I think for both, actually, President Trump and President Putin, they're both losing this game. I think, well, particularly given the tariffs that have come up, because now oil prices have plummeted, and I think oil and gas make up about 30% of Russia's economy, and this is a serious. They're the lowest they have been in 4 years, and this is pretty serious for the Kremlin to have the oil prices go way down. Their economy is already in trouble. Inflation is very high, 10%. So this is the last thing, this is the last thing they need. And this is sort of a consequence of Trump's trade war. So Putin look, he has to maintain, um, he has to really maintain this conflict at a pretty high level if he's going to make any progress. And this is expensive. And he's losing huge numbers of soldiers. So to have the economy go on the skids is very dangerous for Putin personally. Now, on the other side, Trump has bragged. Remember, before he was elected, he was going to get a peace in Ukraine, on the first day. And after he spoke with President Putin, Trump and his spokesman were very optimistic, and this was all going to happen, and it got all this publicity. And now suddenly we see the conflict actually growing and becoming more intense. So I think both leaders have lost a lot of face.
And there is a sign as well that 100-day limit. I know this aim of when Trump wants to end the war has changed several times already, but that 100-day limit that has been set since Trump came into office is still clearly in the minds of the US administration. There were comments by Secretary of State Marco Rubio that he will know in weeks if Putin wants peace, and that they're going to be watching for these actions again, which has come to the core of what the US are expecting here. What signs should we be watching for from the Kremlin that's Secretary of State Rubio might be looking for?
They're sending Dmitriev here just a few days ago was a sign that they wanted peace. But on the other hand, Dmitriev isn't in a position to sit down with U.S. negotiators and say, "Well, we'll do this, we'll do that." He's an emissary. I think that I think that right now, well, first of all, the first sign on Russia's part would be if they stop this intense bombing and killing civilians like they're doing. Now they say that the initial temporary ceasefire was that they weren't going to hit each other's infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And I guess that's sort of been, Russia has been kind of holding to that. But look at what it's doing in the meantime. And it's moving all these troops in. So frankly, I don't think there are going to be any signs to look for, unless for some reason President Putin feels intense pressure on the part of his elite, or perhaps dissatisfaction with the war effort. But that's a long process. So I don't think so. I don't see. Sadly, I don't see any signs for this conflict to end quickly.
One action Putin has taken, as you mentioned, is Russia's call up of these 160 roughly more soldiers into the Russian military. Those troops might not actually end up going to Ukraine, but if Putin doesn't go for peace or some sort of ceasefire, he may well need a new wave of mobilization for the war in Ukraine this year. What sort of impact is that going to have on Russia, and could it be threatening for the Kremlin?
I think it is. And remember, when he did this in September 2022, when he had this large mobilization, there was a lot of dissatisfaction. And the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense avoided any further mobilization for that reason. And that's why they started letting Yevgeny Prigozhin, who ran this Wagner private military group, go in and contract convicts from the prisons and so on and so forth. I mean, they were trying to prevent any large mobilization. And I do think that, you know, look at Russia has made they've had very little success when you look at the situation in the long term from when they invaded in February of 2022. I mean, they're still, I think, only maybe they've occupied 19% of Ukrainian territory. And recently, their advances have been much slower. So again, we're talking about a somewhat longer process, but I think at some point, yes, Russian citizens are going to really sort of lose their support. The support of Russians for the war is going to diminish, and I think that there will be dissatisfaction with the Putin regime. It's and particularly now that the economy isn't doing well. So I think unless Russia is able to make some really substantial advance in this new offensive, if the war is drawn out, I think it's undermining Putin's authority. And I might add that um, the the fact that Putin has sort of that Trump, in aligning with Putin earlier vis-a-vis the peace in Ukraine and so on and so forth, and all this talk about easing sanctions and better relations, Another big plus for the Kremlin was the fact that the relationship that the U.S. has with its NATO allies is becoming very strained. And, this is exactly what the Kremlin wants because, of course, it fears NATO more than anything. So this was very encouraging to watch the European allies become disenchanted with the US and vice versa. But on the other hand, a side effect of this is that um, Europe is now deciding that they're really going to try to pull out all the stops to support Ukraine. So I think that, um, for Putin, things have not gone all that well.
Well, I do want to come on to Europe in just a moment, but meanwhile, in the US, I mean, last week Trump had said he was pissed off with Putin over the negotiations. How does the Kremlin take that sort of language and threat? And do you think the Russians have, historically, how would the Kremlin and Russia deal with a kind of more bellicose and slightly unpredictable actor like Trump?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, everybody seems to find Trump very difficult to work with because he operates, he follows his instincts, and his instincts aren't necessarily rational or you can't predict what he's going to do. And I think that Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin are kind of learning the hard way. Now, it's interesting because there's uh, there was a lot of speculation a few weeks ago about Trump actually having sort of aligned himself with Russia a long time ago. When he went over in 1987, he wanted to build a hotel in Moscow, and he met with all these Russians and a couple of defectors, former KGB officials, officers, have said that he Trump actually kind of made an agreement that he was going to promote the Kremlin's interests as a sort of an agent of influence way back, right? Now, these allegations have been made many times before, but it's interesting because I haven't discounted that possibility at all when I saw how Trump was cooperating last month with Putin. But now he's done a kind of an about face, and so um, I think that maybe he isn't kind of under the thumb of Putin, and more likely he just basically will do anything to make a deal, and if the deal doesn't work, he'll just turn around and change his mind. So I think that I think that the Kremlin is learning the hard way that Trump is not in any way someone that can be counted on.
And there's been a slightly back and forth reaction to Trump so far. I mean, Putin and the Kremlin did seem to stop calling for Zelensky to be removed, but then that only really lasted for a matter of weeks. I mean, is there any sign that the Russians feel any need at this point to drop any of those key sticking points on Ukraine about leadership, disarmament, shrinking the military?
No, Putin made that very clear last year. I think it was in June when he gave a long speech. They keep talking. Putin and Kremlin officials keep talking about the underlying causes of the Ukraine conflict, and those underlying causes are the NATO alliance, the fact that it's come so close to Russia's borders, the fact that the Kiev regime is is illegitimate and needs to be removed. So these underlying causes have been made very, very clear, and I don't see Russia backing off from those demands unless, for some reason, it doesn't succeed in making any military advances, and support for the war at home it sort of erodes. I would say that if Trump really wanted to end this war, um, he should have, at the very beginning of right after he was inaugurated, um, announced that he was going to give more military aid to Ukraine. And if he rallied around his NATO allies and they all, together decided that they were going to really, really, really support Ukraine so they could win this war, that would be something that would have been something that would have forced the Kremlin to be much more flexible in terms of its peace negotiations. But right now, with NATO sort of splintered, I don't think we can count on that.
Trump threatened oil when he made those pissed off comments. He threatened further sanctions. I mean, how heavily is Putin relying on oil revenues for this conflict? And are they going to be concerned about oil starting to dip because of the trade war between the US and China?
They're very concerned about gas and oil, the price of gas and oil dropping, and I think that I'm not. I'm not convinced. I think sometimes when Trump talked about tariffs, well, now of course that he's excluded Belarus and Russia from tariffs right now. Um, but I think when Trump makes those threats, it's more to show people here and in the West that he's strong and he's not letting Russia, push him around. The drop in oil prices that are a consequence of Trump's trade war, of course, are something that are entirely different. And yes, they are a big threat.
And how serious could it be for Putin if these negotiations do collapse? I mean, he may be willing to continue the war in Ukraine, but is the rest of Russia?
Well, as I said, I mean, the Russian people are in general very patient, as shown by the fact that they've stood by their leader, Vladimir Putin, now for all this time, after over 3 years of a conflict in which thousands and thousands of Russians have died. Um, but I do think that it's entirely possible that if Russia does not continue to make advances in Ukraine, and if the economy in Russia deteriorates further and inflation goes up, I think, and there are more and more Russian deaths of Russian soldiers, and also mobilization, where you've got younger Russian soldiers being drawn into the war. I do think at some point that the Russian people are going to lose, that they will not support the war, and their approval of Vladimir Putin will also decline.
And I do want to come on to Europe now and Ukraine's European allies. I mean, as you say, they've all said at least that they want to step up support. In the first instance, they've been sending munitions to Ukraine at a slightly increased pace. Is Europe's unification behind Ukraine? That surely wasn't part of Putin's aim for this war, was it?
No, no, I think all of us were sort of pleasantly surprised by the fact that the Europeans, I mean, they're not completely united, as we know, but they're doing a pretty good job um, at responding to Trump and his lack of support for the Ukraine war effort. I mean, clearly uh, the Europeans feel that they are more threatened by the Ukraine conflict, and the fact that if Putin, did sort of make huge gains, and if there was a peace that allowed Russia to have considerable control over Ukraine and its government, this would be a huge threat. more of a threat to Europeans than the United States. But of course, in the long run, that's not quite true because we are still obligated to our NATO allies, and really, it is just as much. Although members of the Trump administration would disagree, it is a huge threat to us if Russia were to actually exert huge influence over Ukraine and the government, because then they would just go on. So, yes, I think most people were very pleasantly surprised by the unity and the determination of the Europeans. And I think the more that Trump sort of acts up and does things like he's doing with the tariffs, which the European Union is not very happy. They're going to retaliate. I think it's kind of driving Europeans together. And this is not something that Moscow wanted to see. And yeah, it's another downside for Putin and his allies.
And Amy, just to finish on Putin's wider aims in Ukraine, since the start of Trump's administration, do you think these ceasefire talks? I mean, do you judge that those have brought Putin any closer to his kind of wider objectives in Ukraine, lifting sanctions, taking the Donbass, ejecting Zelensky? Is any of that closer now than it was a few months ago?
Well, let me put it this way. Um, by sort of responding and establishing a relationship, supposedly a good relationship with Trump, and having these negotiations, I think that one of the aims was, of course, on Russia's part, was to undermine support in the United States for military support for the war in Ukraine. And so the more that Russia can look like it's friendly and it's going to make these concessions, the better it is in the long term. Because I mean, really, I think for the Ukrainians to really succeed, I mean, if they wanted to drive Russia out of their country, they would need U.S. military support. So I think from that standpoint that that Russia has achieved a certain amount, and I think it's really unlikely that I think that Ukraine is going to have to cede, at least the amount of territory that is already occupied by Russia, and I think they're going to have to make um, a certain amount of concessions, and one will be that they probably won't be allowed to have peacekeeping forces within the country from Europe or the United States, or NATO. Um, but I think that it's going to be very difficult for the Kremlin, unless they really, as I said, unless they really make a lot of have a lot of success in occupying further amounts of territory in Ukraine. I think it's going to be difficult for them to force the Zelensky government out and to establish a government of their own choosing. It's going to be hard, and I don't think that it's going to be possible.
Well, Amy Knight, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.